Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us and tuning in. Tonight, I am joined with Stan Gordon. Stan has been a researcher and investigator in the UFO and cryptozoology field since 1959. During this time, he's been at the forefront of many big time cases, such as the Kecksburg UFO crash and the massive 1973 UFO Bigfoot wave in Pennsylvania. Adding to this, Stan is the producer of the award-winning UFO documentary Kecksburg: The Untold Story, as well as the author of 3 books: Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook, Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, and Astonishing Encounters: Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures. I'm also joined with Joshua Cutchin. Josh is the author of 5 books, including Thieves in the Night and Where the Footprints End. Along with this, Josh is a folklore theologian, a musician, and a paranormal researcher whose work and theories, in my opinion, has helped to breathe a whole new life into the somewhat dormant field of the paranormal. Now, I got these two together because they've never actually met, and they have so many similar ideas and theories that Stan and I were talking on our last interview, and we thought, man, it would be amazing to get these two guys together because, like I said, they had never met, and yet they have so many similar theories. So how are you guys doing tonight?
We're doing great. At least I'm doing fine. Thank you very much for having us on.
Oh yeah, you're
Yeah,
welcome.
I'm absolutely, yeah, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. This has been a moment that I've been waiting for a long time because despite having, I think Stan, I think you're in every one of my books, in some form or fashion. So just despite having referenced you quite often, we've never spoken. So this is one for the record books.
That's for sure, and I've been looking forward to this night, so I think it'll be a very interesting program.
I agree. So one of the theories that you guys kind of share is the fact that so many Bigfoot encounters also include a UFO encounter as well. Can we talk a little bit about that, Stan? I know that you've investigated many accounts that are like that, and Josh, you've written about many accounts that are similar to that. I want to talk about that a little bit and the ideas that you guys have together on this.
Okay, well, I'll give a little bit of history in my background and research. I started in this, as you said, I was 10 years old in 1959 as a curious kid interested in science and electronics, and I happened to hear a radio show, and they were talking about strange happenings such as hauntings and flying saucers and strange creatures, and I went to our local library and started reading all the books on the topic and cut articles out of the paper, made scrapbooks, and I was 16 years old in 1965 when the Kecksburg incident happened, and I've been out in the field ever since investigating all kind of phenomena. And in 1969, I set up a hotline for the public to report UFO sightings, which has never stopped ringing since that time. Reports come in here of all kind of strange things, UFOs, Bigfoot, cryptids, other anomalies. And in 1970, I founded the first of 3 volunteer research groups to investigate these cases across the state of Pennsylvania. And the groups were kind of unique in that most people involved were specialists. We had scientists and engineers and technicians and police officers, former military people, all kind of people from really amazing specialty fields who were volunteering their time to investigate these cases, and we all worked a full-time job. But I set up the group so we could respond to cases 24 hours a day. And by 1973, we had extended to cover the whole state of Pennsylvania, and we were very, very busy with the reports coming in, and we were actually surprised. We began to get referrals from the police departments, the news media, and so we had reports coming in on a continuous basis. And so 1973 comes around, which we talked about on the show before, so I'll just say first we had the biggest UFO outbreak. It started January 1st of 73 and continued to the last day of the year with hundreds and hundreds of UFO sightings. And many of those were not lights in the sky. They were large structured objects seen close to the ground. Then in the summer of 73, we had the biggest outbreak of Bigfoot sightings ever documented. That went on early 1974. And coming in from many, many areas, widespread areas, many sightings in daylight, sometimes multiple creatures, Many times our teams would get out the location within minutes to hours after they occurred. There'd be physical evidence at the scene. But it was during that time, and I'll let this go back to Josh, that we began to realize that some of the information coming in was highly unusual, something I was surely not looking for on my team, because I had always thought that Bigfoot was very likely some type of unknown animal. Well, my ideas and thoughts began to change as all this information was coming in. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this this evening.
That must have been just an absolutely harrowing time to be alive and to be doing that. I mean, I look at the stuff in Silent Invasion, and it's just like, it feels like, it's been a minute since I've looked at how close those cases are to one another, but it sounds like just something was happening every other night. It's just absolutely nuts. And, I would say I'm jealous, but I know how terrifying these things can be, so maybe I shouldn't say that. But, so I like you, Stan, I was always firmly in the flesh and blood Bigfoot camp, and I really kind of wish I was still there, to be honest with you, because that's a stance that might have an end goal. If Bigfoot is stranger than that, I'm not sure if there is ever going to be an answer that we're going to get for this. But Bigfoot was my primary interest as a young boy who was into monsters and stuff. I think I might be repeating myself from the last time I was on this show, but I started off as like a monster kid, like into monster movies and creature features and stuff like that. And it was sort of a hop, skip, and a jump from that to looking into stuff like Bigfoot. My dad had subscribed to the BFRO newsletter before I was born, I think. So it was sort of, entertained in the family, and we would talk about it. And I was convinced that Bigfoot was a big hairy ape. And then somewhere around 2015, I started getting interested in the UFO stuff, and specifically, the altered states of consciousness angle, some of the really more esoteric stuff with UFOs. And that really opened up a whole new world. And I still had this sort of vestigial belief that we might one day, bag and tag a Bigfoot body. But that suspicion slowly eroded over time until, I was really looking at Bigfoot within the same continuum of stuff like ghosts and UFOs and whatnot, because there's just such a rich vein of folklore to be mined from that. And then in 2018, my friend Tim Renner came to me and said, "Hey, let's write a book about weird Bigfoot." And the rest is kind of history. I was kind of hesitantly, towing that line for a while, but I'm all in on the weird Bigfoot thing now, because there just is so much resonance with all these other different traditions. And something I wanted to ask you, Stan, is how much grief did you get, and do you continue to get? Because I just have barely been vocal about these sort of weird, quote-unquote, weird Bigfoot beliefs, and we'll use that as a catch-all term for all the high strangeness. But I've only just, relatively recently been into this, and there are some people who feel very strongly about this. I would argue that the people who believe that Bigfoot is a flesh and blood creature are more sure of themselves, and B, more defensive than the extraterrestrial hypothesis community is in ufology. And I was wondering what this has been like over the years to sort of weather that storm.
Well, so going back to 1973, when all these strange cases come to our attention, and I would recommend that your listeners go back and listen to the interview that I did previously on the show that I think you've just put the link up recently, and it goes into detail about some of the very strange cases we uncovered, because believe me, I was not out looking for this type of thing. I was out thinking we're dealing with an unknown animal. And, of course, you didn't have the kind of communication we have today back in 1973, so a lot of these reports were coming in from the public, initially to the police department, so sometimes in the newspapers, because back then that's how you reported these things, and then they would refer them over to my team to investigate. And, all these cases are coming in. Well, as these reports are unfolding, one of the odd things that we began to notice was we go out to some of these locations where there were trails of large tracks with big strides between them under all type of ground conditions, and then later in the wintertime, the same thing was turning up. You'd have these large, unusual footprints that would just abruptly end when there should have been more tracks. And there was no way, under the conditions we found them, that they could have been fabricated. I mean, I had police officers, I had forensic people in my group. There's no way it could have been fabricated. And this is going on. Right now, in the last couple of years, we're getting reports like this continuing to take place in different areas. So that was one of the odd things that first began to make us scratch our head, like, what's going on? Then the reports began to get interesting from widespread areas. We'd have people who saw Bigfoot in daylight, and they said they were watching this thing, and suddenly it physically vanished and disappeared, and seconds later reappeared in another location nearby. Sometimes we'd get reports of a Bigfoot that didn't look completely solid, or sometimes there were certain parts of the body that they could see through they were missing as they were running away, which just didn't make any sense. And then I remember getting a call from I believe it was a call from a police officer out in Derry Township along the Chestnut Ridge, which I'm sure we'll talk about again, out in Derry Township, Westmoreland County, where there's been a continuous history of all kind of phenomena along that area. And the officer had told me about this fellow had contacted them, and he and his wife one afternoon were taking a scenic ride. It was a beautiful afternoon, and the man was very, very shook up and upset. And he said that he and his wife were riding down the road when this huge hairy creature suddenly walks out right in front of their vehicle. He hit the brakes, but he couldn't stop in time. He hit the creature, and upon impact, it disappeared. And then in the weeks ahead, the reports began to get stranger and stranger. You'd have this pattern where you'd have a UFO sighting in a particular area, with the minutes to hours and days later, you'd have a UFO sighting, or vice versa. And then we had those amazing cases, which we talked about on the show, which I go into great detail in my Solid Invasion book, where you had a UFO and a Bigfoot seen together at the same time and place. And, of course, that one case that really stands out, and I'm not going to go over right now unless you want to talk about it again later, but that was that case of October 25th, 1973 in Fayette County, when he had multiple witnesses, like 15 people, that see this barn-sized sphere hovering low and going down into a pasture, and then 3 fellows went out to the scene, and this object was on the ground or right above it, but now it was a big white dome about like a half a sphere that was illuminating in the area, making this high-pitched whining noise, and there were 2 Bigfoot creatures in the field at the same time. And it's an amazing story in itself. But there were other cases, many other cases, and ever since that time, there have been numerous other incidents going on right through, in fact, the last several weeks of another report that came in. And this kind of stuff is going on. But back in 1973 and in the early 70s, so it had been probably 74, 75 actually, I began to have contact with a lot of the well-known names in the Bigfoot field in those days. So in our country and out of the country. And I made contact, and many of these researchers told me they were aware of these really odd reports of the disappearing Bigfoot, the disappearing footprints, but they were afraid to write about it or talk about it because they were afraid that they would be laughed at by their fellow researchers. They didn't want to get involved. But my position was, this is what we're documenting. I don't have the answers, but I think it's important that people know this is what the public is reporting. And so I started writing about it. And over the years, more and more, as I talked about this, I've been lecturing to the public on these topics since after I was out of high school, actually, in the late 60s. And, in more recent years, before the pandemic hit, I was doing multitudes of lectures in many areas, and I was doing programs on this particular topic and getting a really very positive response from the public on these strange things about Bigfoot and why we don't have a body. And now, just as with Joshua's book, there's others out there been writing about similar findings from this country and other parts of the world, and it's coming out more and more now, and more people in the Bigfoot field aren't laughing at this topic like they used to, because for years and years, the people in the UFO field did not want to associate UFOs and Bigfoot, and the people in the Bigfoot field didn't want to connect Bigfoot and UFOs. the whole point I want to make is I am not suggesting that Bigfoot is a passenger in a spaceship from another planet or a pilot from another planet, but somehow there's these cases where there's some association. And we don't know what we're dealing with the UFO phenomena. I said years and years ago, the indications I've seen after investigating thousands of UFO cases that we're dealing with more than one origin to the unknown category, the UFO mystery. So maybe a certain percentages may possibly be extraterrestrial spacecraft, not from the Earth. But I think more and more, and this phenomena, as I'm finding out more and more, it's not just Bigfoot, but there's many other anomalies that might well be connected, including other cryptids, but I found some patterns, and we're dealing with a phenomena that has a physical and a non-physical component to it, and for lack of a better term, I think we're dealing with something that's interdimensional.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that a lot. And the interesting thing about this is that it really does sort of tend to put you in alignment with some of the skeptical positions, because some of the skeptical positions are dang fine positions, you know? I mean, like the fact, as you alluded to, that we don't have a body is, I think, a glaring issue in the whole flesh and blood hypothesis. You know, you'll have people say, "Oh, well, you know, we don't have a lot of bear bodies. You don't find those a lot. You don't find a lot of mountain lion bodies." And I'm like, "Yeah, but they have been found at some point, you know, in human history." So I always find that to be a weak argument. But what I think is really interesting about sort of approaching it from, I mean, you know, interdimensional, paranormal. I really don't have any issue personally interchanging those terms, because I think we're just grasping at something that we don't quite have the language for. But, you know, it reminds me of that Terrence McKenna quote of, you know, if it's real, it can handle the pressure. And, you know, if you're pursuing the truth as you have been, from an absolutely, I think, incredibly defensible position of just being like, this is the truth of what we're seeing. You know, we've got the data should be put out there, and we should draw our own conclusions from all available information that we have. And, you know, it's interesting when you do that, you find out a lot more about the people involved than you do about the phenomena, I think, because the things that they say or they assume, the assumptions that they make, always, I think, say a lot about their own viewpoints. You know, the idea, like, well, it can't be, or it's coincidence, or you know, on the other end of the spectrum, you know, the UFOs are dropping the Bigfoot off, or the UFOs are, I think John Green at one point said the Ufonauts are as interested in Bigfoot as we are. And it's like, okay, well, maybe. Or we can, at the same time, do something that I think is completely intellectually responsible, which is just saying, here's the information. Here's the data. Here are the correspondences between things. And we can just sit with that and say, I don't know what it is. I'm not going to try to force it into one position or the other, but I'm just going to say that somehow these things seem to be connected, and they seem to show up in different ways at different times. And I think that's what, you know, a true comparativist would do. So yeah, I also think, you know, you made the allusion to other cryptids, and I find myself, the older that I get, the list of cryptids that I actually hold out hope for being discovered as, you know, actual creatures is kind of vanishingly rare. Like, you know, I'm a big thylacine advocate, but we know that once existed. But once we start coming around to stuff like lake monsters and Bigfoot, maybe Mothman, which I always have trouble putting in the cryptid category anyway, but let's say Mothman's a cryptid. These things all sort of feel like they're part of that goblin universe, that interdimensional in-between zone that you were alluding to.
Yeah, it's the more I know about this whole phenomenon, the stranger it is. There's no doubt about it. And yeah, there's so many interesting little details that keep showing up. And, you know, one thing that I got involved with, which shows some interaction here between these various phenomena, I started investigating back in the 1960s what I called mini UFOs. And that was really intriguing. So prior to the 73 outbreak in 1972, this is when things began to open my eyes. And in 1972, I believe it was spring and summer of 72, actually only a few miles away from where I live in a large wooded area, I began to suddenly get calls from different property owners calling in, reporting similar things. So all of a sudden, along this large wooded area, people start reporting screams and cries in the woods, hearing something heavy bipedal walking around. They begin to see strange lights, including these very small, little spherical objects close to their home, close to the ground. They were having Bigfoot-type sightings. Something in one case was seen chasing a dog in the woods. odd footprints were showing up. Well, that's when I started realizing some things are really unusual. But going back to 1960s, I began to investigate what I called mini UFOs. And these were very small, luminous, in most cases luminous objects, but not all of them were. So the smallest ones were maybe an inch or two in diameter. So they were just bright light sources like large overgrown fireflies or lightning bugs. But more often were the reports of an object that was generally spherical, but not always, about a foot or two in diameter, sometimes larger. Some were solid metallic. In other cases, they were just bright light sources of various luminous colors. And these things would come very close to people. And interestingly, I had cases where they would pace vehicles. I've had them enter people's homes and cars through open windows. Sometimes they would float around and go back out the window or go right through a wall of the house or right through the body of the vehicle. And these are going on year after year. But what's most interesting is in more recent years, not only in Pennsylvania, but throughout the country and around the world, we're hearing more reports of these small spheres of light that are being observed in areas, one, where there's a lot of history of Bigfoot sightings. So many Bigfoot researchers have been reporting now, seeing these small spheres of light in the trees, coming low to the ground, sometimes approaching them. And also you're getting reports of these in areas that are hotbeds for other phenomena. So, you know, we've all heard about the Skinwalker Ranch. Well, some of the phenomena I was dealing with in the early 70s was very, very similar. But over the years now, I've been involved in a number of focus on
There we go.
where you either have a history of these things going on or suddenly the phenomena seems to target and all kind of strange anomalies begin to occur.
Well, I mean, it's just ball lightning, right?
Yeah.
Swamp gas.
That's what so I think that the sort of, I mean, so obviously orbs that look metallic are of a different nature than these, or presumably of a different nature than these balls of light. But I think that's one of the most compelling things is the fact that you see these balls of light across all the different phenomena, like you mentioned, and it's often so context dependent. You know, if it's in a house, it's a ghost, and if it's if it's around a fairy fort in Ireland, it's the fairies, and if it's if it's in the sky or anywhere else, it's a UFO. And I think again that sort of says a lot about the assumptions that we make. But one thing that I did want to sort of touch upon, and I completely forgot what it was. Oh yeah, did you ever see any of them that were? Or did you ever get any reports of mini UFOs that were mini saucers?
I can remember some cases, years and years ago, some very
Right.
small little discs that were seen, not that common. Over the years we had reports of larger objects emitting smaller objects as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. The reason I'm asking is because I just read the other day, or was reminded the other day, that supposedly during the remote viewing projects at SRI, the whole Uri Geller sort of that constellation of people, they were reporting like poltergeist activity in scientists' homes, as well as odd large birds outside scientists' homes involved in the project, and literally mini flying saucers that would like float down their hallways and such. So it's interesting.
Well, again, so yeah, go ahead. You kind of faded away on me.
Oh, that was an interesting little correlation there. That's all.
Yeah, and you're talking about the large birds. Now, again, I don't know how large you're talking about, but of course, here in PA, I've dealt with multitudes of thunderbird sightings, which are also very, very intriguing, including some very interesting cases that happened this year down in eastern PA and up in this part of the state. And I've been doing those for years and years. And some of those cases are most interesting. And, again, with all these different cryptid cases, there's some elements which suggest we're dealing with something that's just not normal and natural. And I've had bird experts, people who throughout their lives studied ornithology. I remember talking to this one person, maybe 4 or 5 years ago who contacted me, and he said, look, I spent my whole life studying birds. And he said, I'm hesitant even to tell anybody. He said, I went through all my bird books for several days before I even called you. But he said, this was a beautiful afternoon. He's here in southwest PA. He's outside, and he sees in the distance this huge flying, what he thought was a huge, he thought it was a small aircraft until it began to flap its wings, then realized it was a huge bird. And he couldn't believe he was seeing something with a wingspan like that. But, you know, in so many of these Thunderbird cases I have, just like with UFO cases, it's very difficult to judge altitude and size. But I have instances where these creatures were very low to the ground, very close to people, and actually on the road, where they were blocking the road and eating roadkill, and they had their wings completely open. So there was a way to get a really good estimate of the wingspan. And I remember interviewing a fella from several years ago in neighboring West Virginia whose car was being blocked on a 2-lane road one morning while this huge 4-foot-tall, huge flying creature was flapping its wings and eating roadkill. And he could see, as it flapped his wings, he could see the wing tips and the dust and dirt going up. And after this thing finally went off the ground, he remembered the area, came back the next day, measured it. It was 21 feet across.
Wow. Yeah, I love those stories, and I mean, it's just another thing on the laundry list of odd things that Pennsylvania has. What I always find really interesting is how, really, with all of these subjects, I always find that there's typically a strong precedent for them in, you know, indigenous lore. And of course, you know, talking about just Native American thunderbirds in general, but I guess even the behavior of these things, you know, I think that's something that really was enlightening to me working in the Bigfoot book. You know, you can't speak about all North American inhabitants monolithically, and there are certainly plenty of tribes that do adopt a more flesh and blood stance. But if you look at the tribes that believe that they are creatures with paranormal abilities, or that Bigfoot are some sort of spirit creature, or, you know, half and half physical, half spirit or something, a lot of the oddities that you hear about in eyewitness sightings, you start to see a precedent for those in a lot of this indigenous lore, and I always find that absolutely fascinating. It's the same thing with the Thunderbirds. You know, people have talked about these large beings and large birds in North America for, you know, centuries.
Hey, we got a user question here, a couple of them. You guys take a second?
Yeah.
So the first question that we had was, have either of you guys ever witnessed anything personally? And that was from Robin.
Oh, man. Stan, that might be you first. You can fit my experiences inside a thimble. Yeah.
Let me tell you this. You know, this year actually, I'm going on over 62 years of research in the field. I have never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot, believe it or not. Everything I've seen, I've been able to identify. However, during that wave in 1973, I remember going out to a farm up in Derry Township, which again was that area. There was a lot of history of Bigfoot sightings and continues to be. And my team tried to stake out some of those areas at night, but there were so many cases going on, it was hard to do that. But one particular night, I got a call from the family. The creature, which had been there more than once, had been back on the farm, and different people had experienced the screams and seeing the creature. So I got a small team together. We hurried back out to that farm. It was already dark, and there were tracks, and I believe there were 3-toed tracks in this case in the barnyard. The dogs wouldn't make a sound, which is, again, the typical animal reaction, which I've seen, and you cannot fabricate the animal's behavior. And very typically, even the most vicious dogs, when they're close to the creature, they generally don't bark. They're shaking, and they cower, and they're very, very afraid. But they also had a large cornfield, and there was something already way ahead of us, bipedal, running through the cornfield in the dark, making this loud, asthmatic, like heavy breathing sound. And I chased it. We chased it in the dark through the cornfield, and I tape recorded the sounds as we chased it, but whatever it was, we could never catch up to it. And so there was at least one case there where I believe I was pretty close. In another case, I didn't see it, but I smelled it. And I remember this case, too. This was another amazing case. And, again, all these cases I go into great detail in the book because we don't have time to get into it. But, anyhow, I remember getting a call from a police chief out in that area along the ridge. And he had been interviewing a mother and daughter who had reported that on this particular evening, so this would have been, let me try to remember, August of 73 when all this was going on. And it was a very warm night. And the mother was lying in bed early morning, and something awakened her, and she turned over, and here's this creature that the window was open, but it opened the drapes, and this thing was bent down looking directly at her face to face, and gave a detailed description of what this thing looked like with the skin, like old skin, could see the hair on it, the eyes. She was terrified. The window was 9 feet off the ground, by the way. And she ran into her daughter's room. Short time later, her daughter was screaming, yelling. She saw the biggest shadow she had ever seen. And right about that time, this horrific smell comes in. She said it was like something had been dead for a long time, rotten egg smell. Anyhow, they went to the police station because they heard news about this thing being seen in the area, but they heard a rumor that police department had shot and killed the creature, and they wanted to see it to see what had been at the house. Well, the police officer went out to interview them and came away convinced they saw something, so he wanted me to come down and interview them, which I did. That was 3 days later. When I got there, you could still smell this horrific stink in the house, like something had been dead for a long time. So that was pretty fascinating. But other than that, in very few cases, I think I was probably close to a Bigfoot, but I never got to see it.
Yeah, that's I'm kind of in the same boat as you, honestly. I've had some stuff that I would pretty unambiguously and comfortably call ghost phenomena, you know. So I don't know if we necessarily want to get into that. As far as Bigfoot and UFOs go, my UFO cup is empty. My Bigfoot cup, so to speak, might have something in it. I don't know. It's sort of like you. It's sort of ambiguous. Is this or is this not what I think it was? Long story short, this was before I got involved in writing about these topics. I was just a passive enthusiast. So I was being a drunken idiot the last night of my small honeymoon getaway with my wife in the North Georgia mountains, and it was a deck overlooking a valley, and we were in the hot tub. No, don't worry, this doesn't get salacious or anything.
Yay!
But, I was whooping and hollering because I was, I knew that vaguely knew that Bigfoot was in North Georgia, and I was making a racket, and then went to bed, didn't think anything of it. And the next morning we got up, and my wife is taking some stuff out of the car because it's our last, we're set to leave, and she says, why did you put that rock there? And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, that big rock behind the car, why did you do that? And I said, I didn't do that at all. And I went out, and there's a rock about the size of a basketball, completely clean, so it didn't have any of the red Georgia clay that would have indicated that it had fallen down from the side of the hill behind the driveway. The driveway itself was at the top of like an eighth to a quarter mile straight up, like, not 45 degrees, but not far off of being 45 degrees up a hill. So, like, the idea of playing a prank and having it be that, relatively subtle on us, didn't seem really like it was anything. It's almost like something just put the rock behind behind her car as a sort of a warning or just a nod or something. It was such that I had to move. Like, I could not have moved the car without having moved the rock first. So there was that, and then I did visit one of Tim Renner's research sites in Pennsylvania, and I didn't have anything really happen with one exception, which was the first night that we got there. We got out of the car, and immediately, I would say probably within the first 90 seconds, something huffed at us and walked away on what sounded like 2 feet. Now, could that have been a whitetail that was grunting? Maybe. It didn't sound like a whitetail to me. It didn't sound like a 4-foot footfall pattern, but I can't say that's Bigfoot either. So that's as close to my experience. There's still nothing in the UFO realm. I mean, I guess I could say yet, with the fingers crossed, but no, nothing like that either.
Awesome. So Arcaset wants to know, what do you guys think about the Patterson Gimlin photos and video? And also, why do you guys think that every Bigfoot photo pretty much is blurry? Stan, I'll let you go because you're the man, Stan.
Well, over the years I've seen a lot of photographs, and I get pictures in on occasion, game cam pictures over the years that we take a look at, and some of them are very interesting, but unfortunately they don't show enough detail. I mean, we've had some interesting pictures that show like a side of a body with very long hair hanging off the side, and with the details of the case, it could be something, but it's not enough proof. I mean, of all the videos I've seen, and there's some good ones out there, a lot of them, of course, I don't think that they really were valuable, but I think the video, rather the film that you're talking about, the Patterson film, of all the ones I've seen, I still am most hopeful that all the research is done that probably is the most likely to be authentic. And let me give you some interesting little tidbits on pictures, because this is something I've been coming up with over the years, because I deal with so many cases on a regular basis, and others are finding the same thing. And one of the anomalies that it keeps coming up is the fact that, a lot of these sightings, you can be in the right place at the right time and just have a Bigfoot walk out in front of the car, for example, or a UFO appears. But in some cases, again, we have these specific areas where you have a lot of repeat phenomena, where you're more likely to see a Bigfoot or UFO in some of these different properties where there's a history of these things going on. But people have attempted at times to take photographs, and some of this goes back to digital cameras, before we're talking about using phone cameras. And people have attempted to take pictures, and when they do, the camera malfunctions. It won't work properly. And that's happened. I know of those cases going back to at least the 1980s. And we've had some in more recent years as well. So one thing that's interesting, historically, going back with the UFO phenomena, going back to at least the 50s, you had reports of these strange, what appear to be solid objects hovering near vehicles, moving vehicles, and when they were close by, the vehicles would experience some type of mechanical problems. They would lose power, the headlights would dim, and the object would move off, and the power would come back on. What rarely is discussed is the fact that you have similar electromagnetic effects on some occasion with Bigfoot. So I've investigated cases where a Bigfoot walked very close to a vehicle, and the engine began to sputter, or the engine would lose power, and the creature would move off, and when the creature moved off, the power came back on. And I'm not sure if you've had these kind of cases as well. So anyhow, again, what I've also found, which is really interesting, I have cases now that I've investigated where it's not just the fact that people tried to take picture of the cryptid, but after the cryptid was gone, there was physical evidence such as a footprint, a paw print, some other evidence at the scene, and the camera would malfunction while they tried to take pictures of the evidence. But soon after, when they went back to their home or office, the camera would work fine. So I don't know if you've come up with anything like that or not.
Well, I mean, yeah. Sorry, I was on mute. I always try to mute myself in case I burp or cough. Um, yeah. So I have. I guess I'll speak first to the Patterson Gimlin stuff. I feel the way about photographic evidence that I do about video evidence, which is I look at it and I say neat, and I sort of move on. And I know that sounds dismissive, but I really doubt that we're ever going to get anything, especially this day and age, with the amount of photo manipulation you can have, that's ever going to prove anything that exists. So it's always going to reside in this sort of nebulous in-between area, where it'll always be like, wow, cool photo. Maybe it's something, maybe it's not, and that's about as far as we'll ever get, even if it's an actual photo of something. Patterson film, I've always kind of been sympathetic towards. But I can't remember. I wish I could remember who said this. somebody said either way it's extraordinary. It's either an extraordinary video of, or film rather, of an actual Bigfoot, or it's an extraordinary hoax. And the fact that, if it is a hoax, that it's lasted this long, I think really speaks to something sort of magical in a in a very, um, magical in an unmagical sense about it, I guess is what I'm saying. Just sort of like the right place at the right time, everything came together and they were able to pull off this fantastic hoax, if that's what it is. I've heard some things from some people that make me think that it actually is a hoax nowadays. But it doesn't really matter to me, in a lot of ways, because I always think that the eyewitness testimony is really where the bread is buttered in any of these sort of topics, UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, etc. Because I do think that some of the things that Stan said really resonate. I mean, people do have camera malfunctions. There's also a whole subset of people who, very much like people who are about to take a shot on Bigfoot, have something come over them where they feel like they can't take a picture, like they shouldn't take a picture. There's also a lot of people who forget to take pictures. you know, um, I know it sounds sort of trite, but if you're confronted with something absolutely beyond your comprehension, you very well might not take a snapshot of it, right? Um, and then I think that there's almost a psychic component to this, by which I mean I think that something comes over people in some instances, that makes them not want to take a picture or not remember to take a picture. Um, I'm sort of dipping my toe into some really esoteric thought here, but if we look at something like George P. Hansen's The Trickster and the Paranormal, he sort of posits that there's sort of a meta position intelligence, and part of that trickster archetype is somehow able to control a lot of these factors, and is able to um, basically puppeteer the situation so that we will never take a good enough photo, um, which is sort of in keeping with his particular hypothesis. The way that this archetype sort of embodies itself is that it has to thrive in areas of disrepute. In other words, it will only exist if it's ambiguous whether or not it does exist. I personally am really sympathetic to those ideas, although they're pretty abstract and you know not a very concrete um, not a very concrete concept. Now, speaking specifically to the idea of engines dying, or just mechanical malfunction, um, yeah, I mean we see this in a ton of different cases all across the paranormal. Actually, I found it in fairy cases. I found it in ghost cases. Obviously, it's a minor trope from ufology, even though the actual first instance of a UFO stopping electronics was from fiction. Um, Martin Kottmeyer with the Magonia magazine has done some great research into that, showing how that a lot of those tropes really started back in like this sort of pulps, from like around the turn of the 20th century. But still, plenty of cases where you see that engine malfunctioning, in cars with UFOs. From what I understand, it doesn't happen with UFO sightings don't disable airplane engines because there are certain redundancies. My friend Greg Bishop has spoken on this, so apparently that's why it doesn't happen in that case. But yeah, ghosts, Bigfoot, big black cats, you find all these things. There was I think we collected one story from West Virginia where someone was driving along and their engine stopped and they saw a Bigfoot and it left, and then they like drove along the road still, and somehow they ended up seeing either another Bigfoot or the same Bigfoot, and the car the engine shut down again. Um, so yeah, it's definitely its own sort of uh, minor trope for sure.
All right. Hey, Stan,
Well,
I got a good question for you, man.
okay.
How many Thunderbird stories or Thunderbird accounts have you collected over the years, and where do these stories like originate from?
Oh my, I couldn't even begin to tell you how many there have been, and it's not just my own investigation. There are other researchers here in Pennsylvania that have been documenting these cases as well. But my gosh, I mean, they go back. I started investigating back in the '60s, and I mean, there's a history of sightings of thunderbirds up in the northern part of Pennsylvania going back to the 1890s. And but the cases I've investigated, again, most of them have been probably 1980s and up to the present. It may be some earlier than that, I'm sure. But yeah, they're very, very intriguing. And so if you go to my website, stangordon.info, there's some interesting cases that happened this year. And a couple of those cases were very, very quite, well, to the witness, they were quite hair-raising, let's put it that way. Here's one case that happened in April this year, and I learned I was investigating some other cases up this way, I believe it was in May of this year, and then I got some reports that happened previously, and this person had contacted me. It's a long story. I posted the whole thing on my website. It happened in Montgomery County, so this is, I believe it was about 40 miles outside of Philadelphia. And but anyhow, it's an amazing story, and this thing actually came down and pursued this person in daylight, was only a few feet behind her when she actually ran into an office to get away from this thing. And what was really intriguing about it was the fact that how she described, I mean, never seen anything so huge in her life, this giant bird, had been on the cell phone talking to her friend, waiting to get into an appointment, was in a parking lot, when this very large shadow came right over the top of her vehicle. She thought an airplane was going to crash on top of her and started screaming and ducked her head. And then she sees this huge flying creature, and it goes up to the top of this building where she's going to go into. And but what was so amazing is that this thing made direct eye contact with her. And she described these fiery eyes that this thing had, but it made direct eye contact with her when it was on the roof, and then dropped down and began to come after her, soar after her, and she actually ran, opened the door of this building, this office, and get away from this thing. Interestingly, I believe it was a few months ago, maybe June or July. I have to look. I have so many reports here. And another almost identical case happened here in western PA, again in daylight. Person was sitting outside when this huge flying creature came down within 7 feet, just like with this other witness, turned its head directly and looked at this other person and made eye-to-eye contact, which is so unusual. And they were both extremely, extremely shook up, and both affected their lives dramatically. And like I said, the problem was that they're telling some of their friends, and nobody wanted to believe them. And this is something that so many witnesses, whether it's a Bigfoot sighting or some of these other creature reports that I deal with, I mean, these people I interview, they're from all walks of life. There's hunters, there's outdoorsmen, there's police officers, professionals, and most of these witnesses didn't believe these stories, didn't believe these things were real until they saw it. And many of these people have had a very hard, difficult time dealing with the fact that they had these encounters. And I'm sure Joshua has had the same thing show up.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the Thunderbird stuff. I haven't really gotten into it too much. I just have a little bit here and there. I talked about it a little bit in my book on supernatural child abduction, because, there is the long-standing history of birds picking people up, which might speak to how these legends originated. While I definitely think that I'm definitely skeptical about us capturing, killing, or videotaping successfully something like a thunderbird nowadays, that doesn't mean that I'm not sort of sympathetic to cryptozoological explanations for them in the past. And there certainly are some discoveries of large eagles that were actually capable of flight, that were actually supposedly snatching up human children and taking them away. Which that's sort of its own sort of cryptozoological rabbit hole that you can go down, talking about accounts of stellar sea eagles and some of the other large raptors that have supposedly taken babies and either never brought them back or dropped them safely. There's a video from, I'm trying to remember where it was from. If you just look up eagle snatching baby on YouTube, you can find some video that's been going back and forth about whether it's real or not, of large raptor coming down and picking up a child and carrying it a couple of feet before dropping it. So yeah, it's an interesting suite of sightings for sure.
So I'll add an interesting little aspect to the Thunderbird reports. Now, this came to me from another researcher, I believe maybe 3-4 years ago. And he had talked to a witness up on the ridge, again, where we've had so many sightings along the Chestnut Ridge. But he told me that this witness said this person saw this huge white flying creature. It was a huge, oversized, I believe he said, looked similar to an eagle, and was white. Now, very rarely do we get reports of white ones. Most of the time they're dark, very dark brown or black. It's a very common color. But in the last 4 or 5 years, I've heard a number of reports of very large white ones. But in that particular case, he said, the witness said it was strange enough to see this huge white flying creature, but she told him, allegedly, that it was transparent. She could see the whole outline, but she could see through it, which is very much what we're hearing with a lot of these other cryptid cases I've been dealing with Bigfoot and other cryptids as well. And then you brought up about the big black cat sightings, the Black Panther sightings. Well, I've been dealing with those for years and years. And that's where I began to find some real interesting connection with the Bigfoot phenomena. And going back to, let's see how my memory is, 1979, on the border of Armstrong and Westmoreland County in southwest PA, a series of incidents began to happen in this rural area that continued on and got actually intensified in 81 and 82. And it started in 79, as I recall, from people seeing a strange object falling from the sky into a field one afternoon. And soon after, the people around the area began to hear screams and see strange lights. And then over a period of time, you had Bigfoot sightings and footprints and all kind of weird things going on. But while you had this big outbreak of Bigfoot sightings there for months and months, you had an outbreak of Black Panther sightings as well. Mm-hmm. So what I began to find over the years is that, and again, I'm not the only one that's found this. Other researchers around the country have too. But sometimes Bigfoot accompanies another cryptid, or they're seen together in the same area that's active. But there have been cases where Bigfoot is seen in conjunction with another cryptid. And there have been some cases, I understand, where Bigfoot and Black Panthers have allegedly been seen together. But now, when you think of Black Panthers, we think about black leopards or black jaguars, an animal that not typically would be reported here in Pennsylvania and this part of the country, where they've been seen all across the country in areas where they're not supposed to be. But in some cases, there have actually been searches for them, and they've never been found. But here was one case, and I don't know if we ever talked about this on the previous show, but here's a case that shows the similarity with some of the other phenomena we're dealing with, but it's a Black Panther. Would you like me to tell you the story?
Yeah, sure.
I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
So this is Fayette County, again, in a very, very active area that you've heard me talk about with some of those other strange reports. February of 83. It's a very cold morning. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning. This fellow's coming home from a friend's house. His car's overheating. He pulls into the driveway, goes in the garage, gets some antifreeze. He goes outside. He's pouring antifreeze into the car. He hears a growl. Turns around and looks. About 20 feet away is this large black house cat that's growling at him. So he didn't think much about it because there's a lot of cats around the area. So he goes back to work, and a few seconds later he hears his second growl, but it's much louder and deeper than the first growls he heard. And he turns around, and he's shocked because the large house cat has now physically grown another foot in size. So the man throws the empty antifreeze jug at the animal, which he hits, and it growls fiercely at him, and takes a few steps back and growls again and moves up the road outside that's well lit. And the fellow runs aside, grabs his pistol, and he comes back out, and he's shocked because now that animal has physically grown to a size of an animal that he had seen in the zoo, a Black Panther. And he described the creature with a long tail and it had luminous yellow eyes, and it swung its tail around. The guy took a shot at it. He wasn't sure if he hit it, but a few seconds later, it physically vanished and disappeared right in front of him.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's pretty cool.
I Yeah, I find I have a real soft spot for these alien big cat stories because my my grandfather owned some property in Catawba County, North Carolina, and he uh, would make reference again. This is before I really understood what was going on, and before I was interested and vocal about this stuff. But he would make reference to seeing the panther out there, and my dad has some stories about hearing some things that sound very much like um, puma calls when he was in college coming home. 40 acres, heavily wooded, and my grandfather said he would see this black panther out there sometimes. Um, and to further corroborate this, I mean, because one thing we hear something from your grandfather or whatever, but with a family friend whose property borders that property and saw it in a field and took pot shots at it. And additionally, there is a picture from a trail cam out there online that I stumbled across several years ago. Lauren Coleman posted it, and at the top in handwriting, it's scrawled on there. It says, something like Panther question mark Catawba County, North Carolina. So I don't know if that was anywhere near my grandfather's property, but it's not it's not like a county in the Southwest. It's not a huge piece of land. So I find that really absolutely fascinating. And then on top of that, you've got the Bigfoot connection, which not only accompanying black cats, but like transforming into or out of black cats in some of these reports that I know Rob Riggs was collecting from the Big Thicket down in Texas. And there was a pretty I think several of the Minerva monster sightings in Minerva, Ohio, had like Bigfoot walking in tandem with these cats. And what I always find interesting is to look back into folklore, and sure enough, if you do that, you can find that it was not uncommon for etchings and art depictions of European wild men to be accompanying lions, to have like lions literally like as pets on a leash on a chain. So yeah, the big cat connection, I think, excuse me, I think the big cat connection has gone overlooked for a long time, and people like Stan yourself, you're you've noticed that connection, and some others have, but nobody's ever really dug into quite what that mean, what it might mean,
Well, I think the whole problem is we have all this data and nobody has an answer. I've said for years and years, and there were cases I was involved with which suggested the possibility that the government had an interest in not only UFO cases but Bigfoot as well. And I've said a long time ago that I think our government knows a lot more about the UFO phenomena than they're telling the public, but they don't have the answers themselves. It's an ongoing phenomena, and I think they've also are aware that there's other phenomena involved. And of course, in recent weeks, there's been more and more talk coming out. You're hearing all about the government interest in UFOs and the connection with the Skinwalker Ranch and the government interest in the phenomena there. Well, these are the things we've been talking about for years, and now it's beginning to get more interest. And I think we're going to find, when this all comes down to the end, and we're probably not going to be around to know this, but that this phenomenon is much more complex. It's far beyond our present scientific understanding. And, I said years ago, the phenomenon is so strange it protects itself, because unless you experience yourself, it's rare that most people will be able to believe this because it's so unusual.
Yeah, I think that's the great irony, is that we all might find out someday, but that's at the end of our lives, and we can't come back and tell anybody. But yeah, I agree with you. I think they know a lot more, but the question is, um, I think they might have more data, and they might maybe know some more correlations. But as far as knowing the capital T truth, I kind of wonder about that sometimes. My mentor Greg Bishop often says that he jokes that the UFO researchers aren't telling the government what they know about UFOs, and sometimes I think that might be the case. And then the other thing, like I know that you and I, Stan, are really sympathetic to the oddball cases, but that isn't. I don't think either of us are suggesting that every single case is necessarily created equal, because there are some. I have my own certain rules of thumb that I have when I sort of am evaluating whether or not people are quote unquote telling the truth. Um, but uh, but at the same time, like there are people. people do make things up, and people do, hoax things, obviously. And when you have all this data, and there's no real good way of necessarily always differentiating that, you wind up with a lot of noise, in your data set. And I do have to say that, at some point, the people who are really involved and invested in the flesh and blood idea of Bigfoot sort of tried to filter out those reports, but I think that their sieve was a little bit too the mesh in their net was a little bit too thin, right? I think that it filtered out a lot of stuff that didn't need to be filtered out. So anyway, at the end of the day, you wind up with this giant data set, and there's signal in there, but there's also a lot of noise, and you wind up in the same problem that Jacques Vallée wound up in when he was trying to put, a bunch of UFO reports into a database, is if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. There's just no way of being able to make any correlations or draw any correlations. To that end, something that I've been wondering how your thinking has evolved, like why that period of time, 73 to 74, like what was going on? Not even like Bigfoot UFO stuff, but was there something like culturally that was happening that you think might have spurred this off, or was there something that you noticed like maybe there were more storms that during that period of time, or was there anything else that seemed just a little bit off, even if it wasn't supernatural, paranormal, cryptozoological, whatever?
I could never find anything. I mean, we looked for years and years, but we really couldn't find anything. And, again, it wasn't happening just in one small community. This was going on for miles and miles and all
Right.
throughout the state. And so, again, you got to remember, the UFO wave of 73 in Pennsylvania was all year long. The United States in 1973 had a major national outbreak of UFO sightings, but that kind of peaked in the fall of 73, and that was making a lot of national news. And while we were having all this Bigfoot activity here in Pennsylvania, and that went on again to early 74, there were also peaks in activity of Bigfoot around the country in 73. So you were having interesting cases, just the top of my head, from, Ohio, I think, Illinois. There was one area a lot of people didn't even know about. There was a really amazing outbreak in Guiles County, Tennessee, that very few people even today knew about. And the same kind of weird phenomenon that was going on here was going on in Tennessee. There were other areas of the country where these things were occurring. So it was going on in different areas in 73, in the 74.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. That David Webb, Year of the Humanoids book. That's right. I'd forgotten about
Yes.
that. Sorry.
And I was investigating not just Bigfoot sightings, but with the UFO cases, we had amazing UFO cases. There were some, I believe, humanoid reports at that time. I investigated a lot of sightings in the 60s, late 60s, of low-level, huge some very human-like creatures, and some the smaller so-called grays, 3.5, 4 feet tall. They're being reported as well. There was so much. I've been involved in so many things over there. It's just incredible. And the majority of people I interviewed, and even today, 99% of them wanted no publicity. And these were very reputable people, men, women, children from all walks of life. Some very professional. I mean, there were high-ranking police officers I interviewed, pilots, commercial pilots, corporate pilots, private pilots, air traffic controllers. I mean, all kind of professionals over the years who had no reason to make these stories up. They wanted no publicity, and they just wanted to know if anybody else saw something similar or why it happened to them. And this phenomenon is so complex. It is so unusual. It's so beyond our comprehension. A lot of it just doesn't make any sense. But there are patterns to it, and there are certain details. And this was one reason I was interested in doing the show with Joshua tonight, because I wanted to see the similarities of what he was finding. And he was bringing up some things as he's talking about the similarities. And one of those things that he brought up a little bit ago was the fact that we're talking about photographing UFOs and cryptids. And he brought up, could there be something that occurs to the person to not take the picture? Well, that's something I've been focusing on now for the last few years more and more, because as I'm interviewing people, so I understand in some cases it was a very short encounter, And these people were just in awe. They were shocked by what they saw. And they didn't even think about taking a picture. But in some cases, the phenomenon lasted a fairly good amount of time. And I asked these people, well, why didn't you take a picture? And, a lot of these people just couldn't come up with a reason like, why didn't I try to take a picture? So, is it infrasound? Is there something else involved? And at some point, I'm not ready to do it yet, but I've been doing a lot more research in certain areas, and I'm finding some really interesting information concerning the changes in the environment, the effects on witnesses and people involved in some areas with this phenomena, and I need to do a little more on it. But there's some really fascinating things, and I think, again, this is very, very complex and so unusual, and it really deserves a lot of serious study.
Yeah, one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating, because a lot of what I do tends to hinge on comparativism, comparing these different phenomena, and to that extent that you're speaking of, people sort of being in a daze, which of course the flesh and blood community always says, oh, it's infrasound. That's the catch-all for everything is infrasound. But there's this recurring trend that you notice when you look at the UFO literature, when you look at these old fairy stories from Western Europe, when you look at and when you look at some of the Bigfoot literature too, is that there's almost this power over sleep that these things tend to have. Like the number of stories that I've found where somebody looks and they see something out their window, be it a gray or a UFO or a Bigfoot, and they just turn over and go right back to sleep is uncanny. Like it's just wild. You hear these stories and you're like, how? The first 10 that you hear, you're like, how could somebody go to sleep after that? And then you're like, oh no, this is a thing that happens in these encounters. And there's some stories that I've found. I call it the unlikable spouse motif, which is very common in ufology, where an abductee will find themselves awake but paralyzed, and they're looking over, in bed at their spouse, and they're like, why aren't they waking up? Like, there's light pouring in here, and there are these beings in the room, and this buzzing sound, and the spouse is just completely out. Or sometimes if they can move, they're like, really shaking their spouse and trying to get them to wake up. And, I've found the same thing in fairy lore. There was a story of an Irish fairy abduction where the fairies came in to take a child, and the mother is raising absolute Cain, and she's trying to get her child away from the fairies, and she's like shaking her husband, and her husband is still asleep. And I'll be darned if you don't find it in some Bigfoot stories as well, which I was absolutely gobsmacked to discover. But Doug Hadjajek up at Snellgrove Lake claims that he was in I think the trailer that they were in. So anybody who's listening doesn't know, Snellgrove Lake is up in Canada, and it's accessible only by airplane, and they have some of the best episodes of Monster Quest took place up there. But like a lot of Bigfoot associated activity and a couple of Bigfoot sightings, right? And he's in the cabin, and it just sounds like the entire cabin is going to collapse in on him, because there's things that are hitting the side of the cabin, and they're running along the top, and they're throwing rocks, and the entire cabin is just alive with noise. And he goes in and he tries to wake up his research partner and his son, and he says he almost feels like he's hurting them, because he's like just absolutely beating on them, trying to get them to wake up. And he just does, neither of them will get up. And then as soon as all the commotion ceases, both of them, he's able to get them up with no problem. And that, I really don't even know what to do with that. But I think that it implies a couple of things. It implies that maybe the primary witness is slipping into some sort of other reality, or maybe they aren't physically there for a moment or something. I don't know, but it just happens time and time again. I mean, there was another incident from someone, I think it was Tom Powell, Bigfoot researcher, who talked about these two researchers who had set up like an alarm system, so that in case the perimeter was tripped, they would wake up and they would know to look for a Bigfoot. And apparently the alarm went off, and the one research partner woke up, and he tried shaking his partner. The sound, the alarm was going off, and he could not get them to get up. And I find that absolutely fascinating when you put that on the spectrum of, again, the forced sleep that you find in UFO accounts, and the power that the Fey folk supposedly had over sleep, because the Sandman was probably a variation of a nursery boogeyman. that was derived from the fairies. And you see these themes emerging time and again, and that really, I think, speaks to that sort of control that you're alluding to, Stan. That whatever this thing is seems to have over people.
Yeah, it's really intriguing, and I've heard those type of accounts as well over the years. Let me ask you this. This is something I rarely deal with, but it's something that's more common in other parts of the country. But there are some people who claim that they've had telepathic communication with a Bigfoot. And I can tell you, of the hundreds of cases I've investigated in Pennsylvania, that's very, very rare to hear this kind of reports. But I can tell you there was one case I was involved in back in the 80s that I was a witness to, because I was there when it happened. And it involved a number of people where Bigfoot had been coming down from the mountain, and they had seen this thing at close range, and I was there with my team interviewing these people. And the one person within the group said that reluctantly that they believed this thing was trying to communicate with them. And while we're there, this person says this thing is communicating that tomorrow morning, the next morning, about 15 miles away from where we were in another county and named a little town, that there will be a UFO incident over that town tomorrow morning. And guess what? The next morning, right over that little community, there were many reports of this very strange sound right over the town. It was so unusual, the police and the fire department were called out and actually made the news.
That's wild. Among so it's kind of funny. The thing that I find most intriguing about that and most amazing about that is not even really the telepathy. It's more of the prediction that actually came true, because if you look across, the scope of, I'm going to use this term pretty broadly, like spirit communication, from seances through UFO stuff, I guess through the Bigfoot thing as well, they're always unreliable narrators. I think it was Emanuel Swedenborg that said that, never believe anything that you get from a spirit. And of course, that happens time again in the UFO, especially the alien abduction and contactee literature. They'll say, "Oh, the Earth's going to end in 1984," and 1984 comes and goes with no ill effect. But yeah, the mind speak thing, I don't know what to do with it, right? Because it may not be that common in Pennsylvania. We found a couple of incidences, and of course, your mileage on the believability of them might vary, but in terms of just like looking across the whole world and people who report this sort of Bigfoot mind speak, it's actually not as uncommon as one would think. And sometimes it's like words, and sometimes it's just impressions. I think volume 1 of Where the Footprints End was already out, and I had somebody that I knew, who was interested in some other stuff, just interested in these fields, come to me after volume 1 was out and say, "Hey, I've got a story of Bigfoot telepathy. Would you like me to put it in there?" And I'm like, "Yeah, anytime I get a story that's, firsthand, that's not out of a pre-published source, I'm all about incorporating those." And he was in New York State, and he said that he worked as a home healthcare provider, right? So he would go to clients' homes and sell them, I assume like dialysis equipment and sleep apnea equipment and stuff like that. And it was 2017, and he had pulled into his patient's driveway, and he says in his head, not in his ears, but he hears a voice say, "Look for me over here." And he looks to the tree line, which is, I think like a football field or so away, and he sees a dark shadow that's moving through the tree line. And he kind of ignores it halfway, but he's compelled to look again, and that's when he sees a Sasquatch where the shadow was. And he said that it was blacker than black, which is something that you run into with, a lot of these shadow people encounters, but also some of the Bigfoot encounters that we've run across. With a conical head, pronounced brow ridge, black leathery skin. And he watched this thing. He said it was about 9 feet tall and about 4 feet across for about 45 seconds, and he said that it bowed to him, and it kept eye contact the whole time. He said it was erratic and jerky in its motions, almost like sort of like a robot or something. But he didn't really feel threatened at all, and he kind of just went in and did his job. When he comes back out, the Bigfoot's gone. But he visited several other times, and he kept on looking at the tree line every time you get there. And he said it was about the fourth time after that that he heard a voice again. This time it was a female voice, and it said, "Don't waste your time looking for us. We only show ourselves when we want to." And you know, I again, like that story. If you're entering Bigfoot, the idea of Bigfoot existing on like the ground level, that's not the story to start with, right? Like you sort of got to desensitize yourself to the layers of high strangeness. But you get to a certain point and you're like, you know what? I have no reason to believe this person would lie to me. I knew him for a long while before he shared this story with me. The tired, skeptical arguments that people are doing this for fame or money are just absolutely ridiculous, absolutely ludicrous. Um, I just you really are sort of left with one of three things: someone's misidentifying something, someone is lying, or someone's mentally ill. And I don't think any of those are really likely in this case or in a lot of other cases. So you're like, well, this sounds like an accurate reading from what they could remember.
Yeah. So I do recall some of the earliest alleged accounts I heard from firsthand witnesses back in the 70s involving allegedly telepathic communication was for people who were shooting at these creatures. And I remember people indicating that they were told in their head, don't reload and don't shoot at the creatures. And I thought that was interesting. And, over the years, I had multitudes of cases during that 73 outbreak where people attempted to shoot at these creatures, which I did not recommend, with all type of weapons, from pistols to 30-06s to high-powered weapons, and nobody ever brought one down. Well, some people hit them and they went down, but they got up and walked away. Or we had those really strange cases like that woman I talked about in the previous show, where the woman heard a commotion on her front porch of her cabin home, opened the door with her 16-gauge double-barrel shotgun in her hand, and there's a Bigfoot standing there 7 feet in front of her, and she pulls the trigger, and the thing, boof, it disappears in a bright flash of light, and it's gone.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. That's one of my favorite ones that I always no matter what I'm working on, whenever I'm going through your work, I always end up stumbling on that one and rereading it, and I absolutely love it. Yeah, it's interesting, the bulletproof thing too. I mean, there are a lot of people who want to sort of explain that away and hand wave it away, and like I get some of the criticisms, right? I mean, you have to know what you're doing to bring down a grizzly bear with a handgun. Doesn't happen often. Has happened before. I think I found an example of it happening like just a year or two ago. From when I wrote from when Tim and I wrote Volume 2 or Volume 1, I can't remember. Anyway, it was relatively recently. But I've seen video of a grizzly bear doing a 180 after being hit with buckshot at point blank range, or rather, sorry, birdshot at point blank range. And also, you have these stories of people hitting these animals with high powered rifles and like clearly hitting them, and they still don't really react at all. They might get up and walk away, and at a slow pace, and it's just, or they vanish, like in the case that you mentioned, and they should react somehow. Like even if you're dealing with something that's got an incredibly thick skin, which doesn't really track with what we know about primate anatomy, right? I mean, like your primate skin is thinnest wherever there's hair, so one would assume that Bigfoot would have pretty thin skin. Or if we're dealing with some sort of thick layer of fat or something, there should still be some sort of reaction because there are some nerves that are being hit there, right? So I just find it frustrating that people don't view that as the oddity that I really perceive it as being.
Yeah.
And even the Mindspeak thing. I mean, what you find is that it sounds strange, but then you look back into again some of the Native American lore, and I think there's a Tillamook legend about one of the giants that they were talking that was attributed the name Thunder, and it was this giant, this cannibal giant actually knew what was in the Indian's head without him speaking aloud. Basically like telepathy in this particular legend. And there was another Choctaw legend that I found that said that they regarded the hairy men as having simple speech, and they preferred to speak in like what they called head speak. So, you do find that people have been interacting with these things with a consistency that you see through the years. And here's the thing about that I have always found really compelling about all sort of Fortean stuff is that, I get a 15-year-old kid in 1987 telling the same story about having feeling like he's been put into a daze and hearing this voice inside his head when he sees Bigfoot. And then you go back and you find, this indigenous stuff that's in a book that was published in 1919 and is at like 3 libraries, but has since been digitized, so now it's available. And you're like, okay, well, how did that kid in 1987 know that, the Siatkos in the Pacific Northwest supposedly were able to hypnotize people? You find these really specific correlations from people that don't have the motivation or the access to some of this earlier knowledge, and I find that to be some of the strongest evidence for the legitimate existence of these things, and for the witnesses being truthful. The strength lies not in the veracity of any individual case, but rather in how these comparisons reflect themselves over time in vastly separated areas, separated by distance and time, I think.
Exactly, and that's what I've always looked at. I'm a detail person, and I like to look for the details and bits of information. And what I found so amazing over the years, in all these cases I worked on, of all these different anomalies, is the similarities of the little details that people told me, or how they reacted when they're telling me about some of the things that happened, because they were so strange. And one little detail that's, I don't know what it means to the phenomena, but I mentioned it briefly in Silent Invasion book, and you mentioned it in your book, was the fact that during some of those Bigfoot encounters in '73, some of the witnesses would bring up that they encountered a strange metallic sound, or a sound like metal tearing, or some type of a metal involvement, whatever that was, with the case. And over the years, I've gotten that from other people, and what connection there is or what it means, I don't know, but I believe you brought it up in your book as well.
Yeah, there's probably a book to be written, and I might write it someday if I feel masochistic enough. But just about the sounds, and specifically like the sounds that happen at the beginning of encounters. You hear this sort of metallic crashes when there's no crashes to be around. I know Tim, on one of his recent podcasts, was this woman who saw a Bigfoot materialize, and he talked directly with the witness. She was in like suburban, like Kansas or something, right? Like in a housing development, and she hears what sounds like a car. She's gardening, and she hears like what sounds like a car crash in front of her. And she looks up, and a Bigfoot materializes on the other side of her garden fence, and they look at each other, and then it just dematerializes. And it's the stories like that like, man, that high strangeness. Not only does it push a lot of my buttons for like the things that I find really interesting, but like I find it hard to believe that people would make up a story that nonsensical, right? I mean, I whenever these stories get a little bit too codified, a little bit too tidy, that's when I sort of start to have my suspicions. So like when people, and for example with UFO stuff, whenever they say, oh yeah, these are the Zorthians and they're from the planet Geblox 5 and they've been at war because of a territory dispute with the, whenever it starts to sound like Star Wars, that's when I check out, right? But if somebody says, oh, I saw a UFO and a rabbit came out of it, and then turned around and went back in, and then the next day I had poltergeist phenomena in my house. I'm like, okay, yeah, I kind of buy that as being an actual, legitimate retelling. And so you've got that story about the woman with the car crash sounds, but you've also got like these buzzing sounds that happened before these experiences, and again these metallic sounds, these sounds of like these rushing sounds, and you'll find these sounds happen. A lot of times people who are having alien abductions will describe similar sounds. People who are having near-death experiences will have similar sounds. People who are, have taken DMT, dimethyltryptamine, have had similar sounds at the beginning of their, quote-unquote psychedelic trip. And that to me implies that there's something going on with consciousness. And it's frustrating because I think that there are a lot of Fortean disciplines that are looking into consciousness as being a critical part of explaining some of these phenomena or helping us to get a better grip on these phenomena. But cryptozoology is going to be the last one to the party in that. And I think that, not all cryptozoologists and not all people who've been interested in Bigfoot, I think that you've been sort of pushing that envelope for, decades now. But the rank and file still seems to be really married to the flesh and blood idea. But it is getting better, as you alluded to earlier to the start of the conversation. And this is actually what I, this is what I forgot when we were talking about the light orbs. People have really opened up about that. I mean, like, I haven't been involved in this as, like, quote unquote a public figure for very long, and even in that short amount of time, I've seen people who I never would have thought would have talked about seeing these lights in conjunction, or lights in the same area where they have heavy Bigfoot sightings. I've seen people start to talk about that openly that I would have thought would have ever talked about that, and that's kind of it's encouraging, I think.
Can I jump in there for a
Yeah,
second?
it is.
So
Yeah.
I was talking with Tobias Whalen not too long ago, and we actually were talking about the sleep paralysis thing you were talking about. And we were talking about how he's from the Singular Fortean Society. I don't know if you guys know him, but pretty good stuff.
Yeah. I know Tobias.
Yeah. So we were talking about how a lot of this phenomena, all of it, Bigfoot sightings, paranormal activity, ghost sightings, whatever, all begin with somebody being in an altered state almost. And altered states are funny because you can be in an you're in an altered state almost every single day. You're in an altered state when you sleep. You're in an altered state when you're driving to work in the morning, and sometimes you get to work and you're like, hey, I don't even remember driving to work. It's because you were in an altered state. A lot of those experiences happen at the same time. And a lot of times they're accompanied by sounds whenever the beginning of this phenomenon starts. And also, there are strange lights that are seen with it too, which could also be put into the whole altered state thing. I know he's researching right now the Chicago Mothman sightings that are going on, and he has all of these, all of these things going on all at the same time, which is crazy because it all correlates with what you guys are talking about in the Bigfoot phenomena and other cryptids.
Oh.
Yeah, and
Oh.
and again, we're just barely even beginning to talk about some of these things we deal with. I mean, the cases I work on, I mean, they're things that some people never heard about, and so it's not just the Black Panthers and the Bigfoot and the Thunderbirds. There are multitudes of floating entities, winged humanoids. We've had cases in recent years, really amazing cases dealing with these tall, skinny, hairless humanoid creatures that they're coming very close to people. Just weird stuff. And but yeah, it's there's so much out there, and the whole point is you've got all these different cryptids that people are seeing. It's impossible for there to be so many unknown creatures out there. But at the same time, you've got so many credible people who have no reason to make these stories up, give me these little details from widely separated areas that you can't eliminate the reports. So there's something more to this than we understand. These things are coming from somewhere. These things appear to come and they go. They're here and they're gone. They leave evidence at times. And, once again, I think, for lack of a better term, we're dealing with something that's interdimensional.
Yeah, I think maybe with why people are starting to talk about the odder things is that we sort of as a culture got permission to talk about altered states of consciousness, and by way of psychedelics with Michael Pollan's book that he released a while back, showing a lot of like the medical efficacy that these substances can have. I'm not saying this as somebody who's done any of this stuff myself. I've been a good little boy. Because honestly, I don't know if my brain could take it, but maybe someday. But yeah, it's funny because a lot of the ufological establishment has been really hesitant to talk about this stuff for a while because they've been like, oh no, you can't have a bunch of druggies talking about UFOs. It's gonna undermine our the legitimacy of our research. And it's like, well, at the same time, what is it? 47, so 56, like 70 years of ufology hasn't really gotten us any closer. So let's start trying some different stuff. And there's some really compelling uh, possibilities there that suggest that it might be key to understanding this. And I think that my current line of thinking, and if you come back and talk to me in 6 months, it might be different. But my current line of thinking is that there are altered states of consciousness involved, access to another place, like Stan is referring to in terms of dimensions. Now, he and I might quibble on exactly what that is. You know, uh, I tend to ascribe to a more medievalist's idea of the other world or fairyland. But I think that is the same thing in all but name, really, in a lot of ways. And I think that if you look at a lot of these traditions, especially the indigenous traditions, you sort of find that they're very aware that you take this substance and there's a part of you, your consciousness, your soul, whatever you want to call it, that goes to another place. Like it's not a hallucination. It's actually like a it's a vehicle to go somewhere. And I kind of wonder, okay, well, what does that what does that interaction look like from the other side, right? So to sort of really reduce what I'm saying, like, is there a Bigfoot shaman in another dimension taking their equivalent of mushrooms and popping up in our reality, And you hear these entities like always surprised whenever they're caught, right? They're like, oh, what are you doing here? And I kind of wonder if there might not be something like that going on. That's a simple and kind of humorous way to do it, to explain it, but I kind of wonder if that's something similar is in that play there.
And Joshua, what you just said is something I was just going to talk to you about in some regard. One thing I've noticed now more and more in recent years, and going back in case I looked at a long time ago, is that there's a reaction from the creatures in some cases. And this is something I think is really important. I think it can be a clue to what we might be dealing with. But whether it's a Bigfoot or some of the other cryptid case I've been involved with, witnesses who are very close to these cryptids have talked to me about the reaction of the cryptids when they realize that the human observer can see them. And they become very startled. They react. They're very upset. And I think that's something very, very interesting. I wanted to know if you came across this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those details that if you're providing a summary of like 15 cases, you kind of start to leave out because they're all the like I've run across aliens doing double takes, and I feel like it happens a little bit less in the Bigfoot lore. It's super common in the alien stuff. I haven't run to it as often with Bigfoot, but that certainly doesn't mean it doesn't happen as often. I just haven't, spent as much time with Bigfoot as I have with the UFO stuff. I guess I'd be considered more of a UFO guy. But yeah, it happens all the time, and it's, there's a streak of, let's see, I'm interested to see if you think that this is true too. There's a streak of like ineptitude through a lot of these encounters on the part of the beings. You know what I mean? It's like they seem omniscient and able to control everything, including reality itself, but then they just end up doing these high strange things, these goofy things, these things that just seem like, why are you doing that? Like, why are you surprised? You came here in a spaceship and you're gathering soil samples in my front yard. Like, why are you surprised that I'm inside the house? Or like, the same way that in the abduction mythos, the way that they're using techniques to supposedly harvest DNA or sperm and eggs that we haven't had for 50 years. I can get a DNA swab with a Q-tip and send it to 23andMe and get my entire genealogy back, but you need to drill a sample out of my brain. It just doesn't. They're so invasive, and it always is. It's almost like a child's idea of what these things would be almost sometimes. I wonder if you've kind of run across a similar theme in what you looked at too.
And you know what? You kind of faded out a little bit, and I missed some of what you were saying there at the end. Can you tell me what you want me to discuss again?
Oh no, just how it seems like, in keeping in line with the surprise that these things often show, it almost seems like they're kind of clumsy in a way about the way that they handle themselves, or about the way that they do things, or they set themselves up for failure to be spotted. Like, they tend to appear in really obvious areas, or they seem to know exactly everything about the witness except they're somehow surprised that like I was in my house and I stepped out the front door. Like, wouldn't you have known that too? So I was wondering if you found a theme of entities sort of being, I mean, for lack of a better term, kind of dumb.
Uh, I really can't say that I've noticed that. Um, the one thing I did notice, and I believe it's definitely interconnected with all these different phenomena we're dealing with, is that the pattern I noticed years ago was that many low-level, close-range UFO sightings and many encounters with Bigfoot and other cryptids occur in the vicinity of high-energy sources. And I think
Hmm.
this is really important because this keeps coming up continuously. So you have many sightings around gas wells and gas lines and power plants and high-tension power lines, radio towers, railroad tracks, bodies of water. I think there's definitely an energy connection to a lot of what we're dealing with.
I think that's an excellent point, and actually, I think I quoted you on that in the Brimstone Deceit, and yeah, it's an interesting point to be made because you also have that persistent motif of not only things like engines failing, but also batteries completely draining of their power. And you find that, I know that Ron Moorhead was running into that at the Sierra site in his Bigfoot research, and of course, obviously, it's a famous a famous famous trope of ghost hunters as well. Like, oh, I came into here with a fully charged battery, and now it's completely sapped. So that's something that you hear definitely. So yeah, I think that it's almost like they're drawing these things draw ambient energy, and if there's an even better power source, which I think we would argue that power substations and gas lines and batteries are more concentrated power sources than just any than other places and other things, just ambient energy. I think that it really does suggest the fact that these things need a certain critical mass of energy to actually manifest.
Well, I think we're going to find, as weird as it sounds, and some of this stuff I am so reluctant to talk about, but I know I'm not the only one that's uncovered these kind of cases, is that, again, with these small spheres of light, you've got these reports of these balls of light that change into cryptids, or cryptids changing in other cryptids. It's so weird. And how many UFO cases, even what the government talks about, you've got so many UFO cases, many I've investigated in recent years, even in daylight, of what appear to be large solid objects that suddenly begin to fade away and disappear, or they physically change from one form to another right in front of the witness, and then they're gone.
Yeah, I mean, and it speaks, I think, again to that idea that maybe like the purest. So let me preface this. Tim um, Renner, my co-author, said something that I think is really prescient, and he said he thought that perhaps the large hairy creature is the rarest form that the Bigfoot phenomena takes. And I thought that was really interesting because what he implies by that is that everything else that we associated with it, the throwing stones, the bad smells, the vocalizations, that those things are sort of like uh, they require less energy to manifest than like a full-bodied Bigfoot apparition, and I think that's a really fascinating and prescient idea. And I would take that one step further, and I would say um, I'm working on a suspicion and have for some time now that the the lights that you mentioned are kind of the purest form of these phenomena in general. So my friend Greg Bishop um, has been playing with an idea for a while, for a couple of years now, that he calls his co-creation hypothesis, which is the idea that the true appearance of these things, might literally be unknowable. Like your brain literally is not wired to understand what they look like, and so either you um, paste something from your mind data bank onto it, um, or the phenomena reaches into your brain and chooses something, but it sort of chooses a form that makes some degree of sense to you. Ginny Randall's sort of talked about something similar in, I believe, her book Sixth Sense. But anyway, and I kind of wonder if, like, okay, well, if you don't have that cultural baggage or those expectations to paste onto the phenomena, what if the ball of light is actually like the actual purest version of this thing? Um, and it's a little bit of a wild idea, but I would take that even further, and I would say that the creation of dimethyltryptamine, one of the most potent psychedelics on Earth, is in your brain right now, and it is triggered by the activation of light. That's the reason that we have dreams that have basically psychedelic imagery, is because uh, dreams use melatonin, which is a close chemical cousin of dimethyltryptamine. Anyway, light is important to regulating this particular um, chemical and compound and a lot of the associated hormones. So I kind of wonder if there isn't something specific about this spectrum of light and this light intelligence, whatever it is, shines its light into us and triggers this dump of this psychedelic that we all have in our heads. And between that and our cultural expectations, we end up creating, perhaps this intelligence that is a light form reaches into our brains and rifles through the closet of our brain and says, "Oh, I think I'll wear a Bigfoot suit," or "Oh, I'll wear a UFO suit." It's just an idea that I play with, but I think that it's really interesting to take a look at these orbs of light not as being, oh, well, here it's a spirit, and here it's a UFO, and here it's something associated with the Bigfoot case, and here it's a ghost light, and here it's, and just saying, look, it looks like something that's consistent with all these phenomena, and that really might be the key to cracking this open.
And I think more and more as we know about it, it's all part of the same phenomena. And there's the same stimulus, whatever it might be. And again, this goes back for years and years. We hear all these strange stories. I think that it may well be that certain people, well, let me go back and try to explain this a little bit. I started this so many years ago. I tried to begin to study some of the background of the witnesses. And, once again, over the years, I found that, again, being at the right place at the right time, almost anybody might have an encounter with a Bigfoot or UFO. A lot of people with a one-time only experience. But in other cases, you've got individuals that have a lifetime of encounters with all kind of anomalies. And I began to try to study these people years ago, and I'm in touch with many of these people even today from years ago. And so what I found out was that in most cases, these people began to have experiences when they were very young children. Many of them had personal paranormal experiences. They had live in haunted houses. They had poltergeist activity in some cases. As their lives went on over the years, they began to have UFO encounters, sometimes missing time. They later had Bigfoot and cryptid encounters. But then later their children began to experience these things, and now their grandchildren. And so I find this very, very fascinating. And I began to wonder from some experiences I looked into that I remember, again, years ago, there was a case where I had a group of people, and only two people in the group could describe seeing this large UFO hovering nearby, and the other people couldn't see and experience it. So could it be that certain people have certain abilities that they're able to perceive this phenomenon or other people can't? Or could the phenomenon in some cases be attracted to these certain people for whatever reason?
That's an excellent point, and it's another area that I think that the community has really softened on. I mean, you used to look back into the earlier UFO literature, and they used to derogatorily speak about people as being repeaters. It's like, oh, they're a repeater. They've seen more than one UFO. We can't believe them. And now the real sense in amongst ufologists is that, oh no, repeat experiencers are not only a thing. They're kind of the main event, and you see that these people will have things like, cryptid sightings and abductions and poltergeist events. And I think that you're absolutely right about there being, it's I'm sure that houses are haunted, but I think people are just as likely to be haunted, in a lot of these cases. And I would suspect that this has something to do with, a lot of these shamanic traditions, which can be hereditary. Often, the spirit world would select for people in their youth to be part of this initiation. But it sounds like it's a something is reaching over and sort of selecting people to be emissaries of our world is the way that I kind of think of it now. And unfortunately, a lot of this ability seems to be tied up with dissociation, which in turn might be a factor of trauma, childhood trauma or abuse. I mean, this is something that, Jeff Kripal has noticed, that Carla Turner noticed, that Kenneth Ring noticed, all these NDE researchers and UFO abduction researchers, is that there's a tendency for there to be trauma, even in more recent surveys of people who have experiences across all the different contact modalities, like the free study that Ray Hernandez was spearheading. I was in conversation with Ray, and he's like, well, 80% of these people said that they didn't have any sort of childhood trauma. And I'm like, yeah, but number one, self-reporting for trauma is kind of, people don't always tend to be open about that, and people don't always tend to think of their trauma as trauma. And on top of that, even that sort of implies that 20% did have trauma, which is like 10% higher than the national average, right? So there might be there might be different ways that people get in touch with this, with the spirit, I say spirit world. I know that's not the terminology we're using tonight, but there might be different ways that people sort of sensitize themselves, I guess is what I'm getting at. And that might happen by chance, and it might happen by meditation, and it might happen by dissociation through trauma. It might happen just completely at random. But I think that there are certain trends that you can see, and you're absolutely right. The theme of people who are repeaters is prevalent. Like I know it's not always this way. I know there are a lot of people who've had one-off experiences, but 9 times out of 10, I run into people who have never had anything happen, or they've had like a ton of stuff happen to them. And then there are the people in between. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I want to jump in there. So I have a question, Josh. I know that you have written about the correlation between fairies and aliens and things like that, and we've all researched and you guys have written about going back in the history of people that have had alien abductions or been repeaters with the Bigfoot or even paranormal experiences. But have you, Josh, or you, Stan, either of you ever looked back to see if anybody that is having an alien encounter or that have had UFO encounters have also had fairy encounters through their lineage?
Oh, I see where you're going with that. So the short answer I would say is no. But I just mean that on a specific level. There are some people who have argued that you can find a preponderance of alien abductees who have Western European heritage. And some of the strongest fairy lore, even though fairies are kind of a universal to all cultures, some of the strongest fairy lore comes from Western Europe. And I would argue that the strongest correspondences that we see are more in line with the Western European fairy tradition than they are, say, the fairy tradition of Mozambique, right? So there's that aspect. You've got people like Whitley Strieber, who, Strieber is a very Germanic name, and a lot of the beings that he sees are small blue beings that he calls the kobolds. He literally picks a fairy name for them to describe them. So, no, I sort of wondered something similar myself when I was looking at the Joe Simonton case from Eagle River in Wisconsin. The famous alien pancake case, because I found a very specific German island fairy lore, that there were these specific fairies on this German island that would give farmers water and pancakes. And I kind of wondered, well, if you went back through Joe Simonton's lineage, would you find that he was from that island? But I never really followed up on that because genealogy research is not something I've ever really engaged in. Stan might have a little bit a different insight to that.
No, I can tell you, and all the different cases I deal with, very rarely have I had incidents involving reported fairy sightings in Pennsylvania. Have been very, very far and few between. I can tell you that I was probably one of the first researchers in the country to get involved in alleged UFO abduction cases back in the 1960s. And over the years, my team and I were involved in a lot of cases. It's also interesting that probably in the last 20 or more years that I rarely hear about them anymore. I mean, very rarely do we hear about these missing time cases where back in the 60s and 70s and 80s there were so many reports coming in. But interestingly, in many cases, at least to what I've received, I hear very few more current type of reports like this.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And if you end up anybody out there who's thinking about writing a book on UFOs, like you find yourself like knee deep in stuff between the 60s and the 80s, and then it does sort of tend to trail off a little bit. I you know, I really don't quite know what to make of that. I don't know if that means that part of what we're seeing is, I mean, I do think that part of what we're seeing is a terrestrial phenomena between, unorthodox aircraft and also between like, you know, certain government agencies using the pageantry of abductions to look like something that they're not, like, right? To like, so possibly the idea of MILABs, military abductions, right? But that is something that I've noticed is that like our our abduction stories are either non-existent or not as good anymore. And it's almost like as we become more jaded as a culture, our stories get worse. Yeah, that's a really good point, Stan. And or maybe it is aliens from another planet and they have got all the information that they need and they've moved on to the next world. I don't know.
What if it's this? And I've talked to tons of people, as you guys have as well, and I try to think outside the box a little bit myself. So, what if we were talking about the pageantry of these events, and whether or not people have just the innate ability to witness these for themselves when other people can't. But what if these things aren't necessarily paranormal? They aren't uh, physical. They aren't anything. What if they're spiritual events? What if they're events that are spiritually meant for that person? And maybe when you're doing a little bit of research, or maybe when, like in Stan's instance, where he's come into some of these Bigfoot encounters, maybe he just then his spirit joins in with this spiritual event. And that would explain a lot, but it would leave more questions as well. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to jump on this, Stan, because this is where my head's at right now. I I have at this snapshot in my life, I feel pretty strongly that there's something like, I think there's a case to be made that a lot of these experiences are personal, especially if you look at the things that people have that tend to look more spiritual. And there's a case to be made that alien abductions, or at least positive UFO contact modalities, maybe that's a better way to put it, do sort of have a spiritual bent, but more than anything, they're personal, right? So you get these unfolding fractals of synchronicities that spiral out from people's lives whenever they've had UFO contact, right? I mean, this is something that Mike Clelland writes a lot about in his work, and these synchronicities, they're always kind of like listening to people's dreams, right? Like when you listen to people's dreams, they don't mean much to you because they're so personal and they're so specific, but they can be really profound to the person who's saying it. So there's that personal component that's involved, and there's also some of these experiences look sort of initiatory, and this is sort of a John Mack, Kenneth Ring kind of idea, that the experience itself sort of acts as an initiation to open people up to a lot of these different things. So I'm really sympathetic to that idea, and that's actually the book that I'm rounding the corner on right now is all about looking at the paranormal through the lens of death, and how a lot of things in the paranormal seem to be tied to our souls and what happens to them, not only in this life when we go to the astral plane or whatever that is, and all those robust traditions that you find, but also, when we finally make that final plunge into the afterlife. So I'm sympathetic to that idea, but I realize that's a minority viewpoint, really.
Yeah, well, again, it depends on how you're looking at all these cases. I mean, these are all personal experiences to everybody, and these incidents, the people all react differently. Each personality reacts differently, but to so many people, these cases have a deep effect on their lives. So it was very, very personal. And many people who were involved in these cases, their lives were changed. I mean, there's some people from, probably 40 years ago or more that I'm still on occasion in touch with. And these people still can't deal with the fact of what happened to them. A lot of people can't accept the fact that they encountered or saw what they did. And so, I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon just to study the people and how they reacted to the phenomena of whatever it might be.
Yeah, and that speaks to something that I've given some thought to, Stan, which is that even if these people, you know, again, I have personally met very few people that I got the impression that they were being deliberately deceptive, right? I mean, obviously there's some that I've met, and there's some that I've met that I think they're just trying to tell stories to be popular or something in whatever situation they're in, right? But a lot of these people, they at least believe what happened to them, and they have been traumatized by it, and they don't know how to process it, and that's part of the reason that I get kind of irritated at how quickly our culture, you know, throws these people under the bus. How quickly this culture, you know, is quick to berate these people. And I'm like, well, look, you're listening to someone who is you know, is really emotionally torn up, or maybe he's even crying about having seen something, and that fear is real. You know, that, to use that term again, that trauma is real, and let's not make fun of them, because at least that part's real. So either you're making fun of someone who, you know, legitimately saw something terrifying, or you're making fun of someone who who thinks that they've seen something, and you know, I think that's just that's not from a place of compassion.
Yeah, I agree. Well, hey guys, we're going on 2 hours now, so I think
Oh man, it feels like I just sat down.
I know we need to do this again. Would you guys want to do this again?
Sure, we'll be
uh,
glad to do it at sometime in the future. We'll be glad to set up a date and do it.
All right,
yeah, that'll be a lot of fun to do this again at some point.
let's do it again, guys. I really appreciate you guys coming on, and I know we had a really good turnout, and again, I appreciate it. Will you guys, Josh? Let's start with you. Will you plug everything you got, man, for me?
Yeah, so you can go to my website at joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. Links to all my books are there, my two Bigfoot books and my other three solo books. I am currently in the middle of winter. This is live right now, and it'll be going up when?
Oh, it's up now. It's up now. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So it's up now. So I have been. It's a real honor to have been working on a project with my friends Greg Bishop, Red Pill Junkie, Susan Demeter, and David Metcalf. We are working on the Ufology Tarot deck. This was Greg Bishop's idea, and it is still, as of right now, still has 11 days to go on Kickstarter.com. And if you just search for Ufology Tarot, you can look into it. It is fully funded, but you can pledge there and get your own copy of the deck when it's finished. Miguel, Red Pill Junkie, has finished 5 cards, and they are all lovely to look at. I'm serving on helping to put together the booklet for the deck, and also the coffee table book that's going to accompany all the full page artwork once we have all 22 cards of the Minor Arcana finished up. So Kickstarter.com, take a look for the Ufology Tarot. We've got 11 days to go, and you can still get yourself a copy of that, and that's what's going on right now.
Stan, where can everybody find all your work and contact you if they want to report a sighting?
Sure, they can they can go to my website, which is Stan Gordon, GORDON.info, INFO, StanGordon.info. Contact information is on there, but the best email is paufo@comcast.net. They can actually contact me by phone, 724-838-7768. My 3 books, Really Mysterious Pennsylvania, The book that talks about that massive wave in '73 with all the really weird UFO, Bigfoot, mystery men cases, silent invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot casebook, and also Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania Unknown Creatures, is on Amazon.com or BarnesNoble.com. And if all goes well, my fourth book will be out in the next few weeks. So you can keep checking my website and Amazon for that.
That's exciting.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, hey, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody that joined in and listened tonight. I really appreciate it. And that'll do it, man. You guys, I really appreciate it. Thank you guys.
Well, thanks for having us on, and happy holidays to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. It was an absolute blast. Thank you so much for making this happen. And yeah, likewise.
Awesome.